Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The first one is going to be the new economic growth numbers in Armenia. The second one is going to be the negotiations in Prague last week between the Armenian government and the Aliyev and Erdogan regimes. And lastly, we're going to talk about the issue of fear and how it actually affects policy making and decision making in this country. Let us start with the economic numbers that came out last week. This covers the period from January to August of this year. And this is what we have. Economic growth is at 13.9%, which is actually the highest in Europe by far. Manufacturing is up 16.4%. Services are up 27.9%. The IT sector is up by 29.5%. The construction sector is up by 14.2%. Exports are up by 56%. What we need to talk about is this is also, complemented by a significant gain in value by the dram against the dollar by about a 20% margin. Obviously, this is a result of too many dollars floating around in our economy. And an interesting phenomenon with that is right now the dram is sort of stuck right above 400. We had this perpetual drop. So it's stuck between 400, 406 to 410. And most likely it is stuck there because of interference by the central bank. And what the central banks do is they come in and they start buying dollars to not allow the currency to appreciate too much too fast because of the economic effects that it has, negative effects that it has on other fronts, because obviously appreciation is good once it's within a context, and in certain areas it helps you and in certain areas it hurts you. Now what's interesting here is this interference is actually not discussed by the central bank of them probably purchasing dollars because by law, the Armenian central bank only has one mandate. They only have to care about inflation and not care about exchange rates at all. But in reality, that's not how the world works. And there's been tremendous political pressure by different business groups in Armenia, in the manufacturing sector, clothing sector, the IT sector, not to allow too fast an appreciation of the dram. And it's obviously that they're responding to it. And the fact that it is stuck in a specific place is the proof of my assertions. Now let's move on to the second topic of the week, and by far the more important one, which was the Prague meetings last week in the larger EU summit between the Armenian Prime Minister and the dictator from Baku and Erdogan. And what can we describe this as? Frankly, we cannot describe this as anything but a humiliation for the country. And we'll get to why I make that case. The first thing that was discussed is that both countries recognize each other's territorial integrity, which is something that they've actually done since 1991. So I think that is not as relevant as what other matters that came up after that. Armenia's position has always been that Armenia has no claims on Azeri territory, but the issue of Artsakh is something that needs to be dealt with between the regime in Baku and the Artsakh Republic. Now, what is relevant in this back and forth is that in all of these discussions and all of the communications that came out of it, there was not a single mention of Artsakh or their particular rights, when, as we know, the bane of all of these conflicts with the Aliyev regime has been the issue of Artsakh and the people's right there to sort of that self-determination for them not to be ethnically cleansed or be victims of genocide. What was ironic afterwards is that after the conference, these negotiations, Aliyev held a press conference in which he said that the citizens of Artsakh are his citizens and they will enjoy all the same rights as his citizens do, which is somewhat ironic, given the fact that his citizens have no rights. In fact, there are no citizens in Azerbaijan, they're simply subjects. So what the world is actually asking is a country that has ruled itself under democratic norms with human rights to go live under a regime that has no human rights and no rights of citizenship. And where does this come from? It's come from what I call the Eurocon that we've been subjected to. Under European pressure, and I suspect others, this government was pressed to drop the case about the right of self-determination for the people of Artsakh, with the caveat that this is going to move towards, let's discuss their human rights in another context, i.e. the important thing is not that, what you call Artsakh, is that the fact that the rights of people there are protected. But what the con is that after we make that concession, in all of these conversations, there's absolutely no mention of the people of the rights of Artsakh, which is quite amazing because that is the bane of this conflict. What is important for us tactically here is actually this. It's very important for us not to have the European Union of this European format to be the primary negotiating format, because it's not a favorable format for us. And in fact, as I've said before, the EU position is actually the closest one to the Aliyev regime position. We need to move as much of these conversations, these negotiations, over to the US, OSCE, as much as the other side doesn't want to engage, into that format as possible and marginalize the European Union on these particular matters as much as we can. The ideal format in settling all these issues is some kind of a Dayton 1995 format in which you get everyone into a room and you solve all problems at the same time. What should be our position? There's no separating the Artsakh issue from all these other issues. In fact, everything else is a distraction. And there's one question that we need to put in front of the world, which is, if you consider Artsakh to be part of Aliyev's regime's territories, does that regime have a right to ethnically cleanse those people living there? Because that is their intent, and their intent is backed up by threats of genocide, which he has repeatedly talked about. If your answer is no, then you have to say, how are we going to protect those people? Frankly, in all of these negotiations, this is the only thing worth talking about. Everything else, including their incursions into Armenian territory, are actually designed to not talk about this particular topic, which is the topic that we need to come back and talk about over and over again. Overall, what is the lesson of all this? Is that regardless of all these talks, regardless of anything that's signed, none of it really matters in reality, because we're not dealing with a normal regime in Baku. We're dealing with a criminalized, aggressive regime whose primary existence depends on aggressions against Armenia and Armenians in Artsakh. The only thing that matters is to put ourselves in a position to be able to defeat the enemy in the battlefield. That is the only thing that matters. It's not something that people want to hear, but that's the reality. You can negotiate all you want, but that's not going to bring peace. In short, frankly, at this point in this country, no one believes in peace. No one wants to hear about it because they don't believe it's real. What people do want to hear about is about weapons purchases, rebuilding the army, and creating a situation in which you can defend yourself. Third topic that we're going to be discussing today is what I call the issue of fear. And why do I want to talk about this? Because fear is actually an emotion and not actually a particular policy point. But in reality, the biggest adversary that we have in our country at this point is actually not the people across from our borders or people that have terrible plans for us. It's the issue of fear, because so much of our thinking, so much of our decision-making on all levels, and starting with the issue of security, is actually based on fear. Which, once taken too far, especially when it comes to state decision-making or policy-making, is actually quite disempowering of the state and of its citizenry. Fear, frankly, is an understandable emotion, especially for what we're going through. It's actually a very useful emotion. It can prevent you from doing foolish things. However, that's more true on the personal realm than it is on a broader realm. You don't run political programs or run public policy on debilitating fear, especially when it comes to diplomatic or military matters. The other thing that this leads to is that we spend way too much time worrying about what others have to say and not what we do, when in fact, 90% of the time, what we do is far more important than what the others say. Now, let me give you examples of where we actually didn't listen to the world and we did things with confidence on our own, and it gave us the results that we wanted in many different circumstances. The first one is independence itself. Now, independence itself in 1991, as we know, this was something that people were demanding, but at the end, the Soviet Union collapsed on its own. But there were many people that were telling us, we're not ready for independence. This country can't defend itself. It's going to be isolated. It's going to be this or that. And obviously, you know, there are some rational basis for those arguments. But at the end of the day, we demanded independence. We want independence. And we've had our own state with all of its difficulties for the past 31 years. Secondly, obviously, the first Artsakh war. Everybody was saying this is not a war you can win. The cost is too high. We should not be engaged in it. The other side has oil resources. The other side has this. They have Turkish support and all of these things. And we ignored all of that. Using our resources, our will, we ended up winning that first war. And to the extent that the Artsakh Republic exists today, it's because of that. Thirdly is the revolution. You know, there was always the fear. What will happen if you do a revolution? It's going to weaken the country. There's actually a case to be made that revolution led directly to war. We can't prove that, but historically that's always been the case. Revolutions are followed by attacks on that country. But we did so fearlessly, and we've changed this country in so many ways, for the most part, especially when it comes to democratic development, economic development on the positive ledger. Let's move on to economic developments. I would suggest for people to go back and read what the world was suggesting to us in the mid-90s, which was essentially for Armenia to become an agricultural country. You can read World Bank documents, IMF documents. And if we would have told them that what will transform this country is the IT industry, everybody would have laughed at us. In fact, many of them did. But however, the one thing that has actually dramatically changed our economic fortunes is not growing strawberries or vegetables. It's been our IT sector, because what you need to be involved with in the country, you're either in manufacturing or in things that are great wealth creators. Obviously, none of this means that we should have illusions of grandeur or not understand our limitations. However, it does mean that we need to be confident. We need to understand what we're capable of, which is far more than what we're doing right now. Organize ourselves, be aggressive, achieve our goals, and most importantly, impose our will on the people that are trying to do harm to us. In close, what is it that we need? We need political leadership and leadership overall. Any kind of leader of this country, any kind of a leader in the diaspora, anybody leading any sector of any economic sectors or social sectors in this country, or an educational one, have to learn the lessons of today. And what are the lessons of today? We need to organize ourselves on what I call the three nevers. And what are the three nevers? The first one is we should never be poor again. And what this means is that we need to continue this accelerated growth that we have, because at the end of the day, that is what will give us the resources to make a functional state, and most importantly, a functional military. The second never is never to be isolated again. And what this calls for is to upscale our diplomacy and our statecraft, the weaknesses of which have put this country in the position that we've been in the past 2 years. And lastly, the third never is to never be weak again, which is about military strength and being able to defend yourself. It should be, no matter how unrealistic it seems, the goal of this country needs to be immediate military parity at the shortest possible time frame with our enemies, and eventually military superiority, and on the long run, exponential superiority. No matter how unrealistic that sounds, that needs to be the goal, and that's what we need to accomplish. Fear will never bring us the three nevers. Only hard work and not giving a damn what anybody else says will get us to those goals. Thank you for joining me this week's episode of Insights.